大家好, I'm Nathan Rich, aka 火锅大王. Today I want to talk about this very strange idea that I hear sometimes that China is a fascist country. If you've been following my videos recently, you've seen one that I made about Sargon of Akkad. And in there, I mentioned something very strange, which is that Sargon has sort of jumped on this bandwagon of other people who call China fascist. And I get a lot of arguments in my comment section of people who say, yes, it's definitely a fascist country, which seems very weird to me. It's almost like all these people either intentionally are pretending that they don't understand what fascism is, or they're just trying to use the most inflammatory word they can think of. The way I see it, though, is that fascism is actually quite incompatible with China's basic principles. Normally in the West, especially in America where I'm from, in spoken common language in the United States, anytime somebody is very strict, you can call them fascist or a Nazi. For example, you can say somebody's a grammar Nazi, or you can say that she's a fascist because she really is strict about driving rules or something like that. But that's not the definition that I'm interested in, because that's just a light conversational word. What I'm interested in is fascism, the actual government. What is the theory of fascism? Let's talk a little bit about political structure. If we were able to simulate a bunch of people suddenly existing on some island and observe them, the moment that they began existing, that would be anarchy. Nobody would be in charge of anything, and everyone would feel that they have ultimate rights. But as soon as we see one person try to do something to another that would infringe on that other person's rights, for example, kill somebody, then we'll start to see a hierarchy form. So anarchy is very unstable. In fact, it can only really last in a frozen moment. As soon as anything starts to change, that anarchy starts to develop into a hierarchical structure. So some basic hierarchies would be, for example, authoritarianism, where somebody is generally in charge of the rest of the group. Now, it's interesting to note that just because something is an authoritarian rule doesn't mean that it wasn't put there democratically. So let's take this simulation as an example. Let's say that there were 10 people on this island, and all 10 said, hey, we need some kind of government. Why don't we all choose Nathan? Nathan, you're in charge. You're in charge of the whole island. Everybody needs to do what you say, and we don't get a vote in the future. It's just whatever you say goes. Well, that's an authoritarian style rule that was democratically established. Now, this is something that a lot of people have a really hard time understanding. Just because something isn't currently adhering to universal suffrage doesn't mean that it wasn't democratically established. Because at the time that there is no government, there's no way to vote. There's nothing in place. And so the only way to really vote is to have combat or to have discussions or to some way or another agree on a quorum and to make a popular change. And so if the popular change is, hey, this guy's in charge, that's an authoritarian government put into place by democratic means. So that's one example of something that could happen from the momentary state of anarchy. Authoritarianism is like most families, I think, in the world. You have at the top of this hierarchy might be someone's grandparents or their mother, their father usually. The rest of the family will have a tendency of following that direction. And that person or persons may have the ultimate authority of, for example, that family. This is also how most places of work are set up. The boss is the person in charge. It's usually an authoritarian setup. There's not really such thing as a democratic workplace for the most part, because generally speaking, the people at work doing various jobs don't have any concept of what's good for the overall company. Authoritarianism is a very vanilla term. It's not really tied to a particular ideology other than somebody should be in charge, not generally the people and not nobody. There should be somebody or some people who are wielding authority over others. Within one country, you can also have a totalitarian rule, which would be essentially that rather than simply having a source of authority, you would actively try to permeate that authority through all avenues of life within that country. Where things start to split off historically with the actual manifestations of these types of governments that have happened here on Earth is mostly split along a few major lines. And there's a big difference between communism and fascism, including Nazism and other types of more vanilla fascism. And it kind of comes down to this. What people consider themselves to be in the center is libertarian. And libertarian is, we care the most about the individual and their rights. And it, just like any other political system, can never truly be manifested, right? You can never grant full rights to every individual, because full rights means your right to infringe on other people's rights. So it's paradoxical, it doesn't really make sense. But you can definitely push in that direction. That's the sort of centrist view on things, is that the individual is key. So with anarchism and liberalism, the focus is primarily on the individual. As you go up the channels of authoritarianism, focuses more to the group. So communism will focus more on groups, fascism will focus more on groups. And so far, it sounds like they're almost exactly the same thing. If you haven't actually thought this through, but you're kind of just going along with the mainstream message of hate because you're weak and you have no actual principles or integrity to do real truth seeking, then it's very easy to just conflate all these together and say, well, X country bad, therefore X country fascist, X country Nazi, every other bad thing that you can think of. But actually there are huge fundamental differences between these two paths. Let's forget the whole left and right thing, because that can just cloud the issue. A lot of that has to do with the size of governments and the sort of attitude towards social policies. Forget all that. What is the fundamental difference between communism and fascism? We know that liberalism and centrism and anarchism focuses on the individual. And we know that communism and fascism both focus on the groups. But what is the difference? It's huge. In the center, they're pushing for something called unenforced inequality, meaning the people in these states will definitely end up creating inequality, but the system itself is not forcing those inequalities. It's passively forcing them. It's an unenforced inequality. So in other words, if you take a bunch of people in this simulation, you dump them on an island, definitely hierarchies will form and there will be inequality, although technically speaking, you're not forcing that to happen. You're just allowing the natural order of things to establish those hierarchies. So that's the center. To the degree that you're on the left, you're pushing more towards an enforced equality. In other words, you're kind of going against nature and you're trying to create equality where otherwise there may not be equality. And that means you're pushing some people down and you're lifting some people up. And you're ending up with a more equal society by helping people who you've deemed need it and by stopping some people from getting so far ahead of the others. Okay, that's socialism. And communism is basically the extreme of that. Everyone is exactly the same. Now, of course, none of these governments can ever fully be realized because there is no such thing as an absolute state of these things. But that's the direction that they're pushing in. The more communistic a place is, the more the core values is that everyone should be exactly the same, for better or for worse. But if you look at the right wing and the fascist chain, it's totally different concept. They do not believe that at all. What they believe in is enforced inequality. What the right will tend to push for is groups, sure, but unequal groups, right? This is why you could argue there's racists all over the place, but in the normal mainstream concept of what racism is in the West, you tend to find those clusters on the right because they're already in this mindset of superiorism, right? America is number one. America is better than other countries. This is the basic tenets of all of fascism. It's the basic concept of we are the elite ones and we are better than others. And that's also why imperialism is on the right and aggressive expansionism is also on the right. You're establishing spheres of value, assigning people into those spheres. This is exactly why Nazism is considered to be on the right, because in Nazi Germany, life was great if you're a Nazi of a certain race, but if you're of a different race or a different status, then you're in this lower level. It's not an accidental situation. The lower you are on this ladder, the worse that you're treated by the government, specifically, directly, intentionally, as part of the entire philosophy and core values of the system. Now, let's go back to communism again. Communism doesn't try to do that. In the core tenets is not that it should be going and finding the large groups of people, separating them out in a permanent way, and creating multiple classes throughout the society. In fact, it's the total opposite. Of course, people practice it very different. The Khmer Rouge is very different than USSR, is very different than, you know, there's all these different implementations, but the ideology is that of molding people together into one group. Whereas the right-wing fascist ideologies is to take one group and to separate it into multiple groups. It's not compatible. And this is one of the big reasons that the number one destroyer of fascism in the entire world ever has been communism. If you look back at who killed all those Nazis, those were communists. And the reason for that is their ideologies are not even compatible at all. So why do people call countries fascist when they're not fascist? It's both because in a common language, you can say anything's a fascist that you don't like, or you think it's authoritarian, or you think it's strict, or it did something that you disagree with. But also because it's a very sneaky way to fool people who haven't thought about this clearly into thinking, oh yeah, I guess it really is a fascist country. No, it's not. We have words, and words have meanings. Anyway, there's so many things like this that are just easy to debunk. If you guys want me to do more of these, let me know, and I will do my best. Thanks, everybody. 谢谢.